everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and what we're going to be talking about today is this issue of losing ground related to, among other things, restoration and reparation. And so we're going to be talking about some of the roadblocks to achieving this restoration and this dynamic of losing ground that is not only what is going on now, but what has perhaps been going on for centuries. And so we're going to address issues related to identity and boundaries in terms of a roadblock. We're going to look at dynamics related to globalism and the propaganda related to globalism. And chief among the things that we're going to discuss is this issue of immaturity, and that goes along with a significant amount of pathology that is being manifested, and so this sort of pathological immaturity. There's also a dynamic related to there being significant distraction and derailment and deception, but that really also fits under that umbrella of immaturity and pathology. We're also going to look at this dynamic of a lack of division of responsibility and labor, and also the role of the internet. For many people, the internet is like a lifeline. People believe that the internet is the end-all, be-all. But when you're talking about something as big as restoration, and you're talking about a process where you're trying to remedy something that is centuries old, the internet can be your best friend in some ways, but in many ways it can serve as your worst foe. And we're going to start with a discussion about the internalization of oppression. Let's get started. And as always, if you see this on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. One of the major things that gets in the way of restoration in life, you can be talking about individuals, you can be talking about groups, is this dynamic of the internalization of oppression. Oftentimes, when groups of people or even individuals are trying to find a path towards a restoration, sometimes what hinders them is this dynamic of the internalization of oppression. And this happens when individuals or groups have been under a system or a dynamic of oppression. And so this can be in an individual relationship, this can be in a collective relationship. And so what often happens is that the individual or the collective, they experience oppression, they experience derailment, they experience sort of stagnation, and that is coming from an external source when it starts off. However, what begins to happen is that the individual or the groups, they will tend to internalize those dynamics and then inflict that upon themselves. And so therefore, after a while, there's no need for this aggressor or this oppressor that is an external source, because the individual or the group pretty much oppresses self or oppresses the collective through a number of dynamics. And to help illustrate this, some of you might want to take a look at some of the old research related to learned helplessness, where an animal was receiving shocks and would be shocked on one side and shocked on the other side, and eventually the animal got the impression that it didn't matter what they did, they were going to be shocked. And so then the animal just rested in the oppressed state. And so that sometimes happens with human beings. When they have that experience, they may do that. They may also create all sorts of boundaries and margins for themselves when the external source has actually removed those boundaries, those oppressive markers. And so therefore the original oppressor is often no longer needed, because the individual will be oppressing self, or when you're talking about a collective, the collective will actually start to oppress itself. And that means oppress individual selves and oppress cohorts or others within the collective. Now, many people think this is the crab in the barrel dynamic, but any of you who are familiar with crabs in a barrel, you will know that that's not really what happens with crabs in a barrel. In fact, when crabs are in a barrel and another crab pulls a crab down that's trying to climb out, it's not because they are trying to keep the crab from elevating. It's a protective measure, because usually when the crab is either being lifted out of the barrel or the crab is going out of the barrel, the crab is often in a situation that is dangerous. And so actually the other crabs pull the crab down into the barrel so that the crab is not taken away and eaten. And if you were to use that same dynamic when you're talking about the internalization of oppression, what one might think then is that sometimes there is no danger when the crab is climbing out, and the others have just been conditioned to pull the crab back into the barrel. And so what seems to be happening a great deal in these teachings and discussions that people are having all over the place related to restorative justice, related to reparations, is that many people are engaging in a system of internalization of oppression. And in some instances, there are actual internal people who are actually external oppressors, but because they look like an internal person, they are not perceived as an external agent of oppression, when in fact that is exactly what they are. And so it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of consternation, but we're going to touch on the issue of identity and boundaries so that you can see a little bit more clearly how this is manifesting. And this is just on the outside looking in, and also sort of as a participant observer. And so we're going to just touch on this issue of identity and boundaries and how this is playing itself out with this dynamic of serving as a roadblock. One of the greatest challenges that people are going to experience individually and collectively on this road to restoration is this issue of ethnicity. And I think that people are minimizing this, and this is also what is causing problems in terms of that identity and boundary dynamic. Many people, again, as we've already discussed, have this belief about who they are, and then this translates into their belief about who other people are. And admittedly, when people have been given this narrative over, centuries, that they have a particular identity, it's very difficult for many of them to embrace the possibility that that may not be accurate. Now, what is happening is that the narrative has been that all Black and brown people are, from Africa by way of the transatlantic slave trade. And many people are not willing to disabuse themselves of that paradigm. And so what's happening is that people are not looking at the totality of who they are, or they have narratives that are actually often based in fiction about, the rest of their identity. And so if they have a particular skin color, they may have been led to believe that's because their ancestor was assaulted. And so that's where that came from someone who was quote unquote white and European. And so many people are unwilling to entertain the reality that many people in America who are Black or brown, they are not all from Africa. Many of them are from Europe, and you can look at individuals who identify as Moors. Yes, many of them have Arabic and African ancestry, but in terms of how they made it to America, they often made it to America straight from Europe. Many of them were kicked out of Europe, and this was the destination along with going into Africa. Many people are actually Indian. This is their home. This is where they came from. This is where they are rooted, and they have no other narrative, and there's no other, paperwork that suggests they came from anywhere else. And for many people, they are a combination, and so they are a creolized sort of combination. And so you may see some Indian and African, some Indian and European, some African and European. And this does not necessarily relate to skin color. So when saying European, that does not necessarily mean that that is a quote unquote white person. So African and European can literally be a black or brown person from Africa and a black or brown person from Europe, or a white person from Europe and a white person from Africa. It could also be an Indian who is a lighter colored Indian or a darker colored Indian with an African or a European. And what this means is that people, again, are forming all sorts of alliances based upon belief systems that may not necessarily be grounded in reality. So you'll have a number of people who are identifying as American Indian now, and sort of taking along other individuals who may clearly be African and European. They may not be Indian, but a number of people who are identifying as Indian now are making the assumption that all other brown people who look brown just like them, they must also be Indian. The same thing happens with individuals who identify as primarily African. They will assume that all of the brown Indians are African and all of the brown Europeans are also African, and this is just simply not the case. And there are many brown people who came from Europe. They were, as we've talked about before, they came through enslavement for many. They came through indentured servitude for many, and some of them may have even been slave traders themselves. And so you've got a variety of things going on here, and one of the big problems is that people are not clear about who all of these people are, and they're trying to include all sorts of people who in many instances perhaps should not be included, but there needs to be clarity about that. There needs to be clarity about those boundaries and about who all of these different people are, and it cannot be based upon skin color. The majority of people in the world have brown skin color, and so brown skin color cannot be the ultimate defining feature when you're talking about this dynamic of restoration and restorative justice and reparation. And one of the things that's happening for people who are identifying as Indian is this dynamic of saying or believing that they have had no mixing with anyone from Africa. And given the fact that many people are just now coming to the realization that they definitely have Indian roots, and they're finding paperwork about that. One of the things that is happening is that many people are under this mistaken belief that they have, had this sort of insular dynamic going on, when in fact, when people were identifying as African American, no one was excluding people based upon this belief that they were Indian and they needed to be exclusive. And so that is a fiction that a lot of people are operating under, that they have had no relationship with anyone who was African and had no relationship with anyone who was European. The fact of the matter is that a number of people, the majority of people who identify as African American, Black American, Brown, Black Indian, the majority of those people have Irish and Scottish surnames. And so they do need to come to grips with, what does that mean? Where did they get those Irish and Scottish surnames from, particularly those who are identifying as Indian, and those who are identifying as Indian and who are identifying themselves as not having any traces of slavery in their heritage. Then the next question becomes, where did those European names come from? And the European names are diverse, and so it couldn't possibly have come from, the impoverished Irish that came over in many instances, and so those would not have been slave owners. And so again, people really need to start to come to grips with the realities of their histories, and that brown European piece is a big part of the history that people need to come to grips with, regardless of what their beliefs might be about skin color. One of the biggest challenges that people are going to face, or they are actually facing right now, is this understanding of ancestors and the identity of your ancestors. If you don't understand the identity of your ancestors, a lot of things that are taking place today are not going to make sense. And so if you are not clear about who your ancestors are, you're not going to be clear about who your historical alliances might have been and who your historical adversaries might have been. For many people, again, they just see skin color, and so they may see skin color and think that simply because they are brown and the Moors, as the depiction on the screen, the Moors were brown, that meant that they had an alliance in terms of ancestors, and they are the same, and they have the same goals, and they have the same history and the same path to this restoration. And people would be in error if they believe that. The Moors primarily, in terms of coming to America, came out of Europe and Spain, Portugal area, and also northern Africa. And so that's not the same necessarily as a brown person who came out of West Africa as a person who was enslaved, related to the king of Dahomey, for instance. And so you're not talking about the same histories. And so you're not talking about the same histories. And so you're probably not talking about the same futures. And you're not talking about the same presents. And so again, you can also look at Cromwell and King Charles. Those are, two totally different histories there. And so those who supported Cromwell are the antithesis of those who supported the family of King James and his descendants. And then you have the Akan, who were not necessarily allied with those from the kingdom of Judah. And so you have all of these different people representing different groups on the screen. And when people are not clear about their ancestors, they may get very, very confused and think that there was one ancestral relationship when there was actually another ancestral relationship. And for people in America who have given up ethnicity for skin color, there's going to be a lot more confusion. And so what happens is people in the Caribbean, for instance, or people in Africa, people in Europe, those people tend to be very clear about their ancestry. And there is a belief in America among people who would be classified as Black or African American. There's a belief that other people in the Caribbean are just as confused about their ancestry as people in America, and that is erroneous. People in Jamaica, for the most part, are not confused about their ancestry. They know exactly where their ancestry came from. So they know if they are of the Akan, they know if they are Igbo, they know if they have Irish ancestry, and they own that. And that's the antithesis of what people in America have been encouraged to do. So brown people in America have been encouraged to simply see themselves as Black. People in America have been encouraged to simply see themselves as white, and so they have, for the most part, been encouraged to give up ethnicity in favor of skin color. And what this has done is it has blinded people to their historical alliances and their historical adversaries. And so people are seeing skin color and making all sorts of assumptions about affiliation that may be far from the truth. And sometimes they will see skin color that doesn't look like their skin color and make the assumption that historically those were their enemies. And this goes for people who are identifying as white and those people who are identifying as Black. And so again, if you are trying to chart a course to restoration, it's going to be very difficult to chart that course if you're trying to chart that course with someone or groups, collectives that are historically perhaps your adversaries. But if you don't know who your ancestors really are, you have no idea about who your adversaries historically or in terms of contemporary adversaries, you have no idea who they might be, whereas other people outside of America may be very, very clear about who you are and about who they are in relation to you. And so you need to have that same clarity. Part of the reason why these restorative justice processes have perhaps been derailed is that it's been a fox guarding the hen house kind of dynamic. People have assumed that people are brown, so therefore they would be good advocates, when they may not be good advocates because they may not have the same issue, they may not have the same motivation for restoration that someone else has, because they may not actually be the same. And so, just to think about this way, we can just look at Europe. And so we can look at brown people, black people out of Europe. And so, you have the Moors, but then you have those individuals who were in support of Cromwell. And then you have those individuals who were in support of the Stuarts. And so if you don't know who your ancestors were in terms of that relationship, you might also have some problems, particularly if other people understand who they are in terms of that relationship. And if you don't understand, what role you played or your ancestors played in terms of, the Indians in relation to the Europeans or the Indians in relation to the Africans, if you don't have a clear understanding of who your ancestors were, you may not have a clear understanding of, who you are today and who you need to be having alliances with today, or who that's even possible with today. And so, of course, all of this flies in the face of, Pan-Africanism, which basically says, forget about all of that and just focus on skin color, and that skin color being the unifying dynamic. But that is far from the truth. You cannot really create alliances with, over a million people, millions of people, simply based upon skin color. And those of you who are arguing a specific justice claim, that specific justice claim really is not about skin color. It is about lineage. And, in order to move forward, you need to understand what your lineage is very clearly. And then you need to understand the lineage of the people that you are asking to represent you. And so if someone is representing you based simply because, they have the same skin color, you might not get the outcome that you need or that you are expecting, because they are not necessarily representing you in terms of your ancestors, in terms of, your historical narrative. And so you need to be very clear about who people are, because all brown people are not the same, all quote unquote white people are not the same, and you need to be clear about who people are in terms of lineage, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of that ancestry. And I'm just going to say this one last thing related to ancestry. One of the big things, again, just to reiterate, one of the big roadblocks is, people making these assumptions about who everyone else is, and then making demands that everyone fall in line with that belief system. And this is happening whether people are identifying themselves as Aboriginal and wanting to incorporate everyone under the sun, or whether people are identifying themselves as African and then insisting on incorporating everyone under the sun under that umbrella. In fact, a lot of the distraction and the derailment that is going on, particularly since, a lot of this stuff is taking place online, a lot of that distraction and derailment is coming from individuals who do not have an authentic investment in that restorative process that people are pursuing. And that's because of their lineage. And so for whatever reason, they believe it behooves them to be distracting and derailing. But of course, if you're not clear about your ancestry and you're not clear about their ancestry, it makes it very difficult for people to understand that that's the dynamic that is going on. And also in terms of representation, people are talking about representation and political dynamics. And again, if people are not clear about who these people are, then they may place trust in people that is misplaced trust, and they may place it there because historically the person may be a major civil rights advocate or something like that, but that does not mean that ultimately they have your best interest at heart. They have their own goals, and they have their own narratives, and they have their own histories that may not align well with whatever direction you are trying to go in terms of restorative justice. And so it's just very important that people understand who everyone is in terms of goal achievement. And as we are wrapping up, we're going to touch on this issue of gaslighting just a bit more. This issue came up with a YouTuber who was discussing this dynamic related to the wrapping of the self in the American flag by those who identify as African American or Black American. And so there has been a lot of shaming going on in terms of the propaganda when people are calling themselves being adverse to the idea of restoration for individuals who are identifying as American descendants of slavery and descendants of American chattel slavery. And so what has been argued is that these individuals are seeking to be integrationist, and this is a ridiculous idea. The individuals are American. That is the American flag. That is the flag that they should be draped in. But again, this comes back to the globalism, communism agenda. And so there is this push to make people believe that America is not their home, and that Africa is their home, and that they need to leave America and they need to go to Africa and then allow other people to come to America and assume that identity that they have left behind. And so it's a big push for that. And so there's a lot of, again, guilting and shaming of people who are seeking restoration. There's an entire campaign going on to sort of magnify Africa and sort of minimize America, and make America seem like the pit and Africa the palace. And so again, this really is just about globalism and about creating this sort of dynamic of migration out of America and into Africa. And so again, people need to be mindful of understanding who are the senders of the messages that you are receiving, because once you understand who the senders are of the messages, you'll be able to better understand what you need to do with those messages. The greatest gift that you can give yourself in terms of restoration above all things is an understanding of your identity, your authentic identity. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.